Have you ever noticed that you can genuinely want your life to change, yet somehow you keep repeating the same behaviors? Maybe you tell yourself that this week is finally going to be different. You're going to start working out consistently. You're going to stop wasting so much time on your phone. Or maybe you're finally going to start working on those goals that you keep putting off. And when you make those promises, you mean every word of them. You're not lying to yourself. You genuinely believe that this time is going to be different. But then a few days pass, and without you realizing it, you begin to slip back into the same routines that you promised yourself that you were done with. Not because you consciously decided to quit, but because you slowly begin to drift back into what felt familiar. And after enough of those cycles, something begins to change. You stop questioning your habits and start questioning yourself. You start thinking that maybe I'm just not disciplined. Or worse, you start thinking that this is just who you are. For most people, that's where the conversation ends. They assume that they lack motivation, willpower, or discipline. But what if you've been trying to solve the wrong problem? Because the truth is, your brain, it doesn't become efficient at what you want. It becomes efficient at what you repeatedly practice. And once you understand that one idea, you'll stop asking, why can't I change? And you'll ask a better question. What am I teaching my brain every day? Whether you realize it or not, your brain is practicing something every day. It doesn't care about the goals that you wrote down in your journal or the promises that you made on a Monday morning. It's paying attention to what you repeatedly do, because from your brain's perspective, repeated behaviors are the only behaviors that actually matter. Imagine someone who's getting home from work in the evening. They spend all day thinking about that business that they want to build. They walk through the front door, throw their keys on the counter, and then they tell themselves they're just going to relax for 15 minutes and get started after. They sit down on the couch, they pull out their phone to watch a couple videos, and quickly, 5 minutes turns into 30 minutes. And before they realize it, it's getting late. And at that point, they tell themselves that they'll start tomorrow. But what's interesting is they never consciously decided to abandon their goals. They simply fell back into a pattern that their brain has practiced 1,000 times before. And that's exactly how your brain learns. It doesn't learn from your intentions, it learns from your repetitions. Every time that a behavior is repeated, your brain becomes a little more likely to treat that as a default response. And that's why routines that once required a conscious effort begin to feel automatic. Think about you tying your shoes when you were a kid. Every movement required your full attention because every movement felt unfamiliar. And today, you can tie your shoes while carrying on a conversation because your brain has practiced that pattern so many times, you no longer have to think about it. That exact process is happening throughout the rest of your life. It's happening in the way that you respond to stress, the way that you spend your evenings, and the habits that you do before bed. Your brain is constantly learning from repetition. It doesn't become efficient at what you hope that you'll do someday. It becomes efficient at what you repeatedly do today, and that changes everything. Because if your brain is always practicing something, and it is, then the real question isn't whether you're practicing. The real question is, what are you practicing? Here's something that most people never stop to think about. Your brain has no way of practicing an attention. It can only practice a behavior. Think about New Year's resolutions. Every January, millions of people decide that they're finally going to get in shape. They buy new workout clothes, sign up for a gym membership, meal prep for a week, and they genuinely believe that this year is going to be different. For the first few weeks, everything goes well, and then work gets busy, and a workout gets skipped, and then another one. Takeout starts replacing meal prepping. The gym becomes tomorrow's problem, and before long, their life looks the exact same way that it did before January. What's interesting is the problem was never that they wanted to change, because most people genuinely want to change. The problem is that you wanting something versus you practicing something are two completely different things. Your brain, it can't become efficient at a goal that you just imagined. It can only become efficient at a behavior that you repeatedly do. That's why someone can spend years saying they want to be healthy while repeating the late night snacking, skipping workouts, and using food to cope with stress. And over time, those behaviors become the patterns that your brain begins to expect. And it's not because you're healthy or unhealthy, it's simply what you repeated. And that's why lasting change feels so difficult. You're not just trying to make one better decision. You're trying to interrupt a pattern that your brain has rehearsed hundreds, if not thousands of times. It's also why lasting change almost never comes from one big breakthrough. It comes from giving your brain a new pattern to repeat until the new pattern begins to feel familiar. Because eventually, what feels familiar starts to feel normal. And when something feels normal, you no longer have to force yourself to do it, you just simply do it. which naturally leads to the next question. How does your brain become so efficient at turning repeated behaviors into automatic ones? So why does your brain work this way in the first place? The answer lies in one of the most remarkable things that your brain is constantly trying to do, and that's to become more efficient. Your brain is responsible for billions of operations every day, so it's always looking for ways to conserve more energy. One of the best ways that your brain does this is by turning repeated behaviors into automatic ones, which allows you to perform repeated tasks without you having to think about it. Think back to the time that you drove a car for the first time. You probably remember how mentally exhausting that it felt. You had to think about the mirrors, your speed, the steering wheel, your brakes, and all the cars around you. Everything demanded your full attention because your brain had never experienced that situation before. But after a few months of driving, something changed. You've probably had that experience of driving all the way home from work, and then you realize you don't even remember the drive. You weren't asleep and you weren't being careless. Your brain just simply became efficient at that pattern because you practiced it 1,000 times. And the same thing is true for all of your habits. Neuroscientists, they often summarize this process with a phrase that you've probably heard. Neurons that fire together, wire together. In other words, every time that you repeat a behavior, the network of brain cells that are responsible for that behavior, they become a little stronger. And as those connections strengthen, the behavior becomes easier to repeat until something that once required a conscious effort now happens automatically. That's also why breaking a bad habit can feel so frustrating. You're not just trying to stop something, you're trying to weaken a pathway that your brain has strengthened over many years while also trying to build a new pathway that still feels unfamiliar. But here's the part that gives me hope. Your brain, it doesn't care whether the pattern that it's learning is helping you or hurting you. It just simply learns from repetition. That means that the same brain that learned to procrastinate can learn to be consistent. It also means that the same brain that learned to be distracted can learn to focus. The same brain that learned the unhealthy habits can learn the healthy ones. Your brain is constantly adapting to whatever you give it. And once you understand that, change stops feeling impossible because you realize you're no longer fighting against who you are. You're working with the very system that your brain was designed to use. If your brain becomes efficient with whatever you practice repeatedly, then lasting change, it doesn't begin with just one life-changing decision. It begins with deciding what you're going to practice today, and that's where so many people get stuck. They spend their lives waiting for motivation to show up before they take action. They tell themselves that they're going to start on Monday, or once they're back from vacation, or once work finally slows down. But your brain, it doesn't know that it's Monday. It doesn't know that it's January 1st. And it doesn't know that you just watched a motivational video. It just knows what you repeatedly do. Imagine someone who's trying to get healthier. For years, every evening almost looked identical. They come home exhausted. They order takeout. They sit on the couch, but then they tell themselves that they'll eat better tomorrow. And then, one evening, nothing big happened. They just simply decided to cook. Now, the meal, it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't Instagram worthy, but it was a different decision. The next evening, they did it again. But a few nights later, they slipped back into their old habits. But instead of deciding that they had failed, they just went back to the new routine the next day. But that's the part that most people never see. Real change, it doesn't happen because you never make a mistake. It happens because every time you return to a new behavior, you're giving your brain another repetition to learn from. Every repetition strengthens that pattern just a little bit more, and eventually something begins to shift. Cooking dinner doesn't feel unusual anymore. Going on a walk doesn't require an internal debate. And reading before you go to bed starts feeling more natural than you grabbing your phone. And it's not because life just suddenly became easier. Your brain just became more efficient at the new pattern. And that's why lasting change feels so slow while you're going through it. Most days, it feels like nothing is happening. But something's happening. You're watching your brain learn one repetition at a time. If there's one thing that I hope you remember from this video, it's this. Your current habits, they're not a measure of your potential. They're a measure of what you practice the most. And that is an important distinction because after enough failed attempts, it's easy for you to start thinking that there's something wrong with you. At first, people say things like I keep procrastinating, but over time, that slowly turns into I'm a procrastinator. They stop saying that I'm struggling to stay consistent, and they start saying that I've never really been a disciplined person. And without realizing it, they've stopped describing their behavior and they started defining their new identity. But if everything that we've talked about in this video is true, then your identity, it's not the problem. Your repetitions are. And that's encouraging because repetitions, they work both ways. The same process that strengthens the habits that you're trying to break is the same exact process that will strengthen the habits that you're trying to build. Your brain, it isn't holding on to your past because you're broken. It's holding on to your past because those are the patterns that you repeated the most. The moment that you begin practicing something different and you keep coming back with consistency and patience, that's when your brain starts adapting. Not overnight and not with one perfect week, but one repetition at a time. That's how every skill that you've ever learned was built. That's how every habit that you formed was built. And that's how the next version of your life will be built too. Whether you realize it or not, your brain is practicing something every day. Every routine that you repeat is teaching your brain what to expect, and every habit that you reinforce becomes a little easier tomorrow. That's why lasting change, it isn't about trying harder. It's about being intentional about the patterns that you want your brain to repeat. So don't wait to feel more motivated. Start practicing the habits that you want to be automatic, even when it feels uncomfortable at first. Every repetition teaches your brain what becomes normal. What you practice today becomes what feels normal tomorrow. And what feels natural tomorrow quietly becomes the life that you live. If this video helped you view habits in a different way, then I would love for you to join the community. I break down the psychology that's behind discipline, consistency, and personal growth so you can stop relying on motivation and start building a life that's consistent by design.